Initially, when all this change started with the shutdown, nothing in my life was changed. I was working exactly the same way. The only thing I chose to do differently is when I would shoot photo reference to build my illustrations upon, I was now printing them in the house. I had projects that were coming to a close. I was finishing covers for a couple different series that were wrapping themselves up in this same time period. And then I was being told, hey, these are a couple of things you have as projects that are being put on hold. So I had my workload go from what felt like way too much every month to now literally 1 week's worth of work each month. And so I've taken my privilege to be able to really focus then on things I've wanted to do for a long time. I tinkered around with sculpture for the first time in a really long time. And I've been creating multiple works of art, finished paintings for stuff that are just projects that would really never come to light of day except, oh, I'll print them maybe in a sketchbook, but they're not going to be more than just personally satisfying. And it's a nice place to re-enter, and I needed a sort of slowdown. I needed an intellectual break. To me as a kid growing up, the bands that had the biggest impact would be the ones that I had on 8-track cassette. And I was old enough to be part of the 8-track generation. So my family only had so many albums that were in the house, and there's only so many things that would reach pop culture-wise all the way down to a young child growing up in that period of the early 70s. So things I was aware of as bands would have been the Beatles and the Monkees. Now, Monkees, of course, were on television, but the Beatles were ubiquitous. And we had the 8 tracks of them, and then I had 8 tracks of, I think, 2 of the Monkees albums, and Headquarters in particular, which I grew up adoring. So I knew I wanted to get a chance to do artwork of them someday. I had snuck them into prior projects. Anybody who knows my work has seen them in Kingdom Come and in Marvel's, snuck into the backgrounds. So I was able to directly pitch them a couple of prints, and they approved both. And the surviving members were able to all say yes to what I turned in. And these early costumes, when they were all dressed as a set, you know, either with the blue shirts that had the big lapels and or with their red shirts, and in particular the piece I started off with that has a certain connection to it. Anybody who's a big fan of the band would know what I was doing here. I wanted to make kind of a strong piece focusing on what kind of a front man I felt that Davy Jones came off as, that he was cast to be that sort of, he was the British face of the group. Something to the energy of it I wanted to capture. It was always my intention to do a lineup of the X-Men this way, kind of making it the point about it being, okay, there was the original 7, which was the Justice League. Here's the most important 6 members, I thought, of the X-Men. So it has Phoenix in her pre-Dark Phoenix stage, and it's a beautiful Dave Cockrum design for her costume, and then Cyclops, Wolverine, Nightcrawler, Colossus, and Storm. And they kind of are the characters that have remained throughout all iterations, the most important. I did this finished, revised version of this painting I'd done earlier when I was 20. I did it again when I was 30, and it's one of the most well-seen pieces I've ever done, and it's been repeatedly seen interpreted into even the Justice League film, where they imitated it in their photography. I was making this specific lineup for a reason. Calling it the original 7 is pointing out how when in 1960 they created the concept of the Justice League of America, these are the first members, those 7 characters. And it was primarily focused around adventures with 5 of them, not with Superman and Batman being there all the time. It was trying to showcase, hey, we have all these other characters. Superman and Batman are successfully in their own books monthly, but here's Wonder Woman with Aquaman, who was definitely a supporting character. He never even was on covers of comics until first 1960 issue, and he had been around since 1941, I believe. He's one of the oldest characters in comics that had always stuck it through every age of publishing, but was now getting bumped up to the big leagues, as well as the new concept designs, revisions of Flash, Green Lantern, and the new character of Martian Manhunters from the 50s. I did a couple different sketches of things to pitch David Bowie's estate, spotlighting of all the various iterations of his personal presentation throughout the years. I thought a great thing to link up to was the painted rendition of him from Diamond Dogs, the famous album that's on the tail end of his look for having that appearance of Ziggy Stardust. Even though he had broken up the Spiders from Mars band at that point, he still was sporting the same shock red hair and continuing with that kind of alien aesthetic. And I thought the bizarreness of that whole upper body of the human being combined with the lower part of the dog legs was a disturbing, unique kind of thing. When you talk about revisiting stuff, there's always that question of like, well, do you have in your mind what would happen to that person later? And I would remind any fan of Kingdom Come that I've actually shown you what I thought would happen later. I wound up incorporating into the JSA series in the early 2000s. I worked on that, doing a series of covers, and then eventually the storyline shifted into a Kingdom Come overlapping thing where we brought the Kingdom Come Superman into the group. It's Superman from Kingdom Come taken at the moment where the bomb goes off at the end of the series and presumably all these people are dead, and in his mind he's blasted into another reality. He's figuring like, my whole world blew up twice. He said he's lost 2 planets, and when it ends he actually gets zapped back to where he came from and then lives out the rest of the storyline of Kingdom Come exactly the way it happened. And I drew new pages to fulfill this storyline, and that was my closure for it, is that the Kingdom Come storyline and the survivors of it did have lives, but they weren't dramatic lives that meant that, oh, they go off and have other adventures together and Superman gets back in his costume. No, he's retired, he becomes a parent, and then he becomes an old man. And it doesn't stop because his lifespan's a whole lot different than ours. He keeps absorbing all that sun energy that keeps him alive. And so I don't even give you his passing because he just gets to be a really old dude, but he's still around. One really weird way of my own evolution was coming to painting, trained one way and then shifting off to a completely different set of tools that I learned for one commercial application, and then having to find yet again another set of tools for what would be my final application of comics. Was initially able to work in advertising where you used markers, or at least at that point. These days you would do it all in computer and, you know, it would all be a color tablet kind of thing. But back then it was actual markers. And still when I do color roughs these days, I use the markers left over or that I've continued to buy since then, just because I work on paper. That's my world. I wound up experimenting in my first comics works a number of ways. My first comic series I did mostly colored pencil on colored paper, which was a real cheat to try and get a sort of faux painted look. My own application of this stuff to comics, I was dissatisfied until I did enough time just investing myself in painting on the art boards, which would be a cold press board where you've got the ability for it to absorb the watercolor or gouache paint. It was a long evolution for me to find the thing I was most comfortable with. Loads of artists are very comfortable with acrylics, and if you got anything else that appeals to you, it's all good. At the end of the day, everybody's just getting a digital file that they're printing from. And so if you create it all with digital tools, all that's workable because they still want the final thing to be this digital delivery. I've used to send in all my artwork physically into the publishers, and then they would do this scanning there and then return the artwork. Nowadays, I just pay my own resource of scanning the work for me. But for the most part, it's just color correcting and making sure that the files are going to be the most saturated for the appropriate way that what goes to print will look as much like the original as physically possible. A painting for, say, a cover, a couple of days, and it's always dependent upon the complexity. I do have some images that you can usually tell by looking at it how long something might have taken me. If it's got a ton of figures in it, then that's almost like not an extra day per figure, but it's a whole lot of extra time in the rendering and the thought process. The more I had to coordinate between foreground, background elements, if it's a whole scene with a city and whatnot all, that's a lot more time in planning and execution. So, but in general, the majority of paintings I do get done within a fairly speedy 48-hour period, sometimes even including the reference shoot of taking some quick pictures of myself doing whatever stupid pose or throwing on a leotard and showing off my wonderful muscles for amplification. Doing pages is more challenging because you're having more compositions within a single block image. So I'm working at a size that's equal with a given page to what I would draw in a cover painting. But because it's all these individual shots that have multiple things possibly going on in each panel, that's more time, but I break up the process where it's never just working on one page at a time. It's working on often whatever I think I'm going to get done within the given month. I'll work on the pencils for all that within, say, 1 week period or so, however long it might take me, given, say, it's 10 pages. I might be able to pencil that in like a week to week and a half, depending upon how hard some of the stuff is in there. And then the painting could take at least that same amount of time, if not a little bit longer. Sometimes as soon as the pencil is done, I feel liberated, and the paint is sort of like nonstop. It's kind of like, you know, I can be fairly fast with the stuff when I feel confident that the drawing anchors everything. You basically might be the worst judge of when you should be done. That maybe you could use somebody around you telling you, like, you should embellish this part a little bit more, you know? And I don't have anybody doing that to me, but I like to think I've elaborated so much in the work I've done that when I leave little aspects that are kind of rough, that it will suit the material enough that it doesn't look like I just fell down on the job. But it's difficult. I can look back at pieces and say, man, I really needed to go in there and smooth out those areas. That rough sort of area that looks like brush strokes is not benefiting the piece at all. It's making it look crudely done by hand, not well done by hand. So I'm never of one mind about it. Like, I'm never 100% happy with my work forever. Like, I could be happy when I did it, look back at it later and go, oh, didn't see that then. Because your perception is getting corrupted by the amount of time you might be staring at something. If you could really always put aside something for a while, return to it when you've almost forgotten what it looked like, and then have a fresh perspective of it, that's fantastic. It's the same reason that if you, in drawing a face that's completely dead on, looking towards the viewer, if you've looked at it through a mirror to see whether or not the eyes are balanced, if the sides of the face look like they properly are synced up, that's an extremely helpful tool. And I almost always remember to do that. But, you know, there's certain things that your consciousness is gonna lapse on, and you want to use as many things as you can to sort of snap yourself back in. I've spent a lot of time always thinking of projects of my own that I'd like to get off the ground, and what's kept me from doing them is often being fulfilled with the work I've gotten to do on things that I've had a lifelong connection to. So when I've imagined doing a project with original concept and characters, but yet I keep having this work come in regularly that features the properties I know how to draw or I would like to engage with, it almost writes itself because you've got a certain amount of it built inside you because you've been absorbing it and reading it all this time. And to completely commit to original material can be somewhat more challenging, but then I have tested that out over the years by working on projects like Astro City, where all the content is original, even when it's reflecting the influence of popular properties. You know, you've got archetypes you could recognize that match certain well-known superheroes or genre concepts. And we get a chance to really exploit and invest in new ways of seeing that stuff and putting our own stamp on it, if not completely creating genuinely new material. So I've always gotten a chance to dip my toe in. I just haven't invested years of my life into a completely original property, which may be where my life will ultimately be taking me. And I'm not sure if I want to put that ahead of other things that remain in my current workload, or if I just need to have the decks cleared completely. There's extremes I know where people get caught up that I can't necessarily account for in terms of the ways in which you get your energy sapped, especially when you don't necessarily have a feeling that the world's supporting you in the physical effort you're making, because this stuff is draining. Making any kind of comics art, or any art at all, is draining. And to keep yourself going, I don't know, other than the simple bare facts of like, well, who else is going to pay you if you don't get that damn thing done? So if that's not enough of a reason for you to get the work done, I don't have much more for you, because to me it's all about survival. Now, I can do stuff too now that's just for me to have fun with, but if the reasons are I do this work and I get paid for it, that kind of needs to be enough. And if it ain't enough for you, there's somebody else to take your job right behind you. The simplest thing of wanting that career is you have to do the work. And part of that work is you have to almost treat it like it's your job before you can get that job, meaning that the samples you produce are addressing all the challenges that would be laid out to you if you're trying to get that gig. Now, a lot of times they're not looking for a bunch of talented cover artists. They've got jobs that need to be done. The people that can pay money for this work, they've got jobs that involve storytelling. If you don't have samples of that, but you've got a portfolio full of pinups, it's worthless. They don't want to see that. They're not looking for guys to take my job. They figure, well, we still got him. Getting into the trenches is drawing the stories, is knowing how to draw interplay, action between people. What was an enormous thing for me to learn more of that, or to get comfortable with more of that, was the work I did in advertising, where I'm drawing stuff in kitchens and I'm drawing storyboard panels of things that I could not care less about. Drawing vehicles, drawing car ads or L'Oreal ads, and I did a lot of Miller Lite stuff back in the day. And that tested my patience in a way to draw the things that were tasked of me, because that's going to be asked of you in this art form. You're going to be stuck drawing things you don't like. And so if you can rise to the challenge of drawing those things, drawing them ably and impressively, there might be work for you. If your work doesn't have stuff that would be regarded as unique to it, you'll get that kind of reaction of, we're not looking to develop talent. We need somebody to be fully formed who's got something ready to go to get in here. And that's the cruelty of this art form. You can certainly self-publish. There's loads of people looking to develop independent properties that you could partner up with. But when you're trying to get that paid work, they're looking for you to already be a fully cooked individual who's got most of this stuff down. For artists that want to follow a realistic style, I don't know that you necessarily have to overthink about an influence like me or any other painter who does realism, you can certainly get a lot from the pieces that we've done, maybe even imitate some of those compositions, but I think you'll find your own way once you're just studying reality, which is what I would do. I mean, if I'm going to look at people, things, photographs, it's beneficial to start shooting your own if you can get into that. And these days, since everybody's got a camera, that's not so much of an issue anymore. Being able to study life as the basis for something is the best. I had the longest problem of thinking I needed to have everybody and every element be perfect before I could use it as a reference source. And so it took me a long time to realize how flexible the basis of the human form is. I've posed for myself on loads of paintings. It's a process of getting your mind comfortable with what you're building off of. And at a certain point, I would say accept that you're gonna feel like you're not seeing it until you've seen it. You know, that maybe you do need to have a thing look like a thing exactly before you're painting from it. What I like about gouache is that the tinted water will stain the paper and look like a watercolor painting. I mean, if I was driven towards getting that real watercolory look, I think I could execute that, kind of render everything out where it looks as much like what's in your mind's eye as possible, where you're not necessarily overthinking what the material was that made it. But then artists I've admired like James Bama and Norman Rockwell worked with oils, and I like that my stuff on Strathmore paper worked somewhat semi-opaque, can kind of have a look similar to the grit that I always saw in the oil paintings by those guys. And I've never ever really fully imitated or followed in the exact way they've done their work. And I hold those guys up to a certain high esteem. Like, if I could have my stuff look like anything, it'd be the Rockwell-Bama group. But I also like the fact that I can execute this stuff that feels satisfactory enough to me that it's in enough keeping with that, and I'm doing something they themselves didn't do, which is this amount of content or this amount of subject matter. You know, Rockwell did one piece that I've only recently seen that looked like as close to him doing a superhero as possible, and it was a painting of Samson. And it's stunning just to see, like, oh geez, if he did that with Samson, put a Superman costume on it, it's like, now you know what his version of Superman would be, and it is incredible. You know, it is seriously a cool looking figure. He had the size and proportions. In fact, I think I even know which of the guys he used as a regular model might have modeled for him for this character. It's awesome. I almost want to go and imitate the specific piece he did of Samson, just drawing a Superman costume on it and going like, see, Rockwell Superman, man. Working on the Hulk turned out to be exactly the kind of gig I wanted, was as far as doing the version of the character I always wanted to do, which wouldn't necessarily have lined up with the creative visions of the artist and the writer working on the book. And magically in this case, it turned out to be one of the most exceptional takes on the character that's been done in several years, because it got really back to the basics, the very first version of the character, the way that Jack Kirby had illustrated him, as well as the tone of the character, that it was sort of like, the Hulk was meant to be scary when he was first introduced. He was not meant to be a sort of mice and men type character of Lenny. You know, he was not supposed to be the gentle giant. He was supposed to be a scary Frankenstein's monster kind of character. And I got to put that in the art I was making without it being just this sort of separate commodity than the content. It was actually in sync with the concept of the writer, and then the artist was doing an exact match for the same tonal approach that I was doing. In fact, he would go on to do possibly the greatest work of his career, showing just enormous range of what he was capable of. So it was a really awesome collaboration to be part of, collaboration with people I've never actually met. So it's a weird thing in some of these gigs. Most of my work history has been to craft projects with writers and interior artists in some cases, if in case I'm not the artist inside, where I work with them hand in hand. I have personal conversations, we go over the material, we craft a story together, and the Hulk is more that more traditional commercial gig, but yet matching everything that I personally wanted to get out of it intellectually and emotionally. You know, because when you approach a gig, you have a certain feel for it. You wanted this job, hopefully. In my case, it usually falls into that category of either I say yes to something because of my personal interest and fandom for it, or I'm building something that I'm making out of whole cloth. And in this case, it's a lifelong connection to the Hulk. Obviously, I could say, you know, when I first encountered the character as a kid, but what made the biggest impression on me that really stuck with me is it has this enormous part of the history of painted comics, because the magazine that was created in the late 70s, same time as the TV show, I was getting semi-regularly. I have a bunch of those in fact, I have now a bunch of the painted covers, the original art for those on my wall, paintings by Bob Larkin that I really loved. It was hugely inspirational as an artist, but it was also this thing of taking a comics character and successfully adapting them into something that felt a bit more real. And Hulk was a perfect fit for that because he didn't have a costume. His skin was kind of the costume, effectively. And so he wound up being this thing that blended in the world of magazine illustration with Conan the Barbarian and all the stuff that was popular at that time. And there was this long run of painted covers by different talented people, Ken Barr, Bob Larkin, Earl Norham, so many people who cut their teeth on this character, and it made the superhero mythology seem that much more on deck for being taken seriously. That heritage and the way it affected me inspired my desire to come in towards being not just a comic artist, but specifically a painted comics artist. That's something that it's nice to have the job on the Hulk book to kind of combine these influences together. So I'm paying tribute to the thing that kind of built me when I was like 8 years old, you know, what really got in my head. The industry for comics is kind of localized to whatever is going on with your outlet for getting comics, getting your store books, and that's always been the thing that's, you know, the cornerstone of how any of this works. Do you have a healthy marketplace? And obviously, the shutdown has impacted everybody harshly, but I'm gratified to know the two different stores that I frequent in Chicagoland, one in suburbs of Chicago, Schaumburg, Keats Comics, and Chicago Comics in the city. They're doing okay, and they're open again, and I've been to both. But I'm thrilled to know that their business is back. Don't know what it will maintain long run. I hope it's everything they intended to be. We all have to hope for that because we need this art form to survive.